How's it going, everybody? Welcome. We have another awesome episode of the Ride Along lined up. We have Mr. Chris Humes. He's a senior vice president at TC Energy, where he's over operations, engineering, and technical service. TC Energy is a major company across the U.S. They actually push about 25% of the natural gas across the country, and he has a lot of experience as at a manager level as well as the engineering and business. So he's got a lot of great insight for us. We're excited to have him. Thank you for coming on.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. Glad to be here. Excited.
So first kind of question that we always ask is, you know, describe kind of what your career journey has looked like up till this point and kind of some of the bigger moments since you decided that this is what you want to go into, how you made these decisions early on in college and so forth.
Yeah, so went to studied engineering, mechanical engineering at Oklahoma State, and actually in the summers I worked for a couple oil and gas companies on the pipeline and just did kind of manual labor, and then uh, latter part of college did engineering internships at both Conoco and Arco. And so when I got out of college, it was kind of a good time to be in the oil and gas industry. It was actually right after the first Gulf War was going on. And so hired on with Arco as a drilling engineer out in the Permian Basin and did that for about 3 years. And that was a lot of fun. And then got transferred over to the pipeline side up in Oklahoma and was kind of a field engineer, reliable engineer, did small projects on pipelines. These were crude oil pipelines and refined products, and then went to Houston and spent time in project management doing a little bit larger projects on the gathering systems for Arco out in the Permian Basin, and then got my first supervisor's job down in Freeport, Texas, where I supervised a crude oil import terminal. So we offloaded about 275 crude oil tankers and then put them in a pipeline going up to Cushing, Oklahoma. Um, and then in '99 transferred over to Sonat, which got bought out by El Paso shortly after I got there. But that's where I started to learn about the natural gas side of the business, and so ran the operations for a company called South Georgia Natural Gas, which was a subsidiary of El Paso, and learned about gas measurement, gas compression, and did that for a couple of years in Thomasville, Georgia. And then went to Birmingham, Alabama. Got transferred up there, and so there I was responsible for the guys that did overhauls on these big engines that moved the gas across the pipeline system. Responsible for the welders that did repairs on the pipeline. And then in 2002, went to Savannah, Georgia, where I ran El Paso's LNG operations for 9 years. And so we had the terminal there in Savannah, did several large expansions there. And we also built an LNG import terminal in Pascagoula, Mississippi as well. And then came to Houston, where I ran the project management group for El Paso. And so they didn't do any big projects. This group did a lot of small ones. So a big project for them was maybe $25 million, but they did probably 300 projects like that a year. And this was back after the San Bruno incident. So they were running a lot of smart pigs and pipelines, wanting to ensure the integrity of the natural gas pipelines in the U.S. And so, you'd have to make the pipelines piggable. I mean, you'd have to run a smart pig, and then you'd find things that you had to repair. And so that group did all of that work. And then Kinder Morgan bought El Paso about that time, and they asked me to run the large projects group up in the Northeast. And so there we were putting in compression and large pipe up in the Northeast, and did that for a couple of years. Those were bigger projects. Those were probably the bigger ones we did were maybe $500 million or so.
Yeah.
And then went to work for Crestwood, which is a midstream company, about 6 years ago. And so midstream companies, we gathered natural gas, processed it. We had 9 cryo plants. We also had underground, about 100 BCF of underground storage where we stored gas underground, and then about 10 million barrels of underground propane storage, and then propane distribution systems, and a trucking company, had about 200 trucks. And then about 2 weeks ago, came to work for TransCanada, or TC Energy as they call themselves now. And so now I'm responsible for the guys that operate the pipeline systems, build the facilities, and then the technical services that go along with that. So we've responsible for about 30,000 miles of pipeline, about 600 BCF of underground storage, and about 4 million horsepower of compression.
Wow, that's pretty insane. So going back to college, was there a specific reason you majored in mechanical engineering? In high school, did you always feel like you were really good at math and that was what you wanted to do immediately going to college? Or was there some, indecisive going into that process?
Well, I was always kind of interested in, I guess, in math and sciences. I did well in them and I was interested in them. My grandfather was an engineer, my dad was an engineer, and so was certainly surrounded by a lot of engineers.
Right.
I think early on in high school, I kind of had this vision of going to work for NASA
Right.
and being an astronaut.
Right.
And as I got into college and got through college, they were really cutting back on the space program, so there just wasn't a lot of those jobs available. But I enjoyed working for pipeline companies in the summer, and you could make decent money, and so it was just kind of a natural progression and just kind of the path of least resistance, I guess. So.
Yeah. What would you say has been the most important skill you've picked up that no one really kind of told you about in college or anything like that, that you kind of had to learn on your own throughout your career?
Well, I think, a couple of things. I think, relationships are always hugely important. And so, particularly at my level now, a lot of what I do is just, make sure I have relationships both with the people that I work with and my peers. Communication is always important, effective communication.
Right.
And I think, just hard work and having a curiosity will take you a long way in life as well.
Hmm. So if you could go kind of, what are your day-to-day operations now at TC Energy? And obviously, you were just mentioning you kind of recently started there. So do you think things are a lot different now than what they were 6 months ago, pre, pandemic and whatnot going on, or has much really changed in the form of operations?
Well, I think, so the last week we actually, with the Hurricane Laura that just hit Louisiana, we have a lot of assets over there. And so a lot of my week this week was focused on just the guys doing an assessment of the facilities and trying to determine what kind of damage was out there. But, I think it'll be interesting to see, a couple of years from now, what things kind of stick post pandemic. I think, pre-pandemic, we always had this perception, particularly in the oil and gas industry, which is a very mature industry, that,
Mhm.
you had to be in the office, you had to be face to face. And I think what it's shown is we can be very effective. We can get a lot of work done by telecommuting or working from our homes. And so it'll be interesting to see what sticks. We always look for ways to reduce emissions and help protect the environment. One easy way is if we all just telecommute on Fridays, that would reduce emissions by 20%, and that's a pretty easy thing to do. And so, but I think, uh, you know, particularly in the oil and gas industry, they were struck pretty hard just with a lot less demand. And so we were looking initially, we were working very hard, long days, trying to find ways to save money, cut costs. Unfortunately, that meant some people lost their jobs as a result of that. But I think now it's kind of now more focused on the day to day, kind of going from good to great kind of focus and trying to fine tune the business and make it better.
What do you see as, what's been the biggest change since you first got started to now? I mean, obviously technology has changed rapidly, but has how we look at engineering changed, how we look at energy? And what do you think those changes are going to look like as we go on in the future?
Well, I think, well, when I first started, actually, desktop computers were just
Okay.
coming out,
Uh-huh.
and so certainly
We've moved a little bit past that nowadays, you'd say.
so, but I think there's for the oil and gas industry specifically, I think there's a lot more focus on the environment. We know we have to be part of the solution, and obviously we need energy to live in a country like we do, but we also need to take care of the environment. And so I think a lot of uh, focus on sustainability across the oil and gas industry. How do we minimize emissions? How do we prevent natural gas from escaping into the atmosphere and those kinds of things, and trying to make the world a better place. And so I think that's certainly a huge change, a big change on continuous focus on safety and working safely and protecting the environment. Um, I think just the tools that we assess our equipment with have gotten a lot better. I started 29 years ago, and back then they had what's called smart pigs that you run through a pipeline to inspect it, and that was kind of evolving technology back then that was just kind of starting, and now it's a lot more sophisticated, and so you can detect a lot more things that make the pipeline safer.
Mhm. What do you see now, for your day-to-day operations? What does that look like kind of at the senior management level versus when you were kind of first getting started in your first couple engineering jobs? I mean, I assume it must be just kind of night and day what your different operations look like.
Yeah, yeah. So, well, I think just to, data is a huge thing, and so it's how do we make better, there's all kinds of data out there, but it's how do you parse through it so that we can make good decisions,
Mhm.
and not just become overwhelmed with all the data. And so I think that's kind of one of the big challenges we have. There's a lot of technology out there to help you manipulate data, gather data,
Mhm.
but it's the technology that can help simplify things and keep it simple and make so that we can make really good decisions. And so I think that's probably another big thing that we're faced with today is just how do you manage all that data to make good decisions.
Uh, in your experience, for the new engineers who have just graduated, they've gotten their degree, they've done some internships, what does their typical role look like in a company like TC Energy or something like that?
Yeah, so they're given a lot of responsibility. So they'll come in and design either meter stations or compressor stations or even pipelines, and do those types of projects. Within their first year, they may be doing projects that are a couple $1 million, and then as they progress through their career, they get more complicated.
Yeah.
Some of them will be focused more on reliability, and so if we have issues where equipment's not as reliable as it should be, or then they'll get involved with how to make things more reliable, more robust,
Right.
or even more efficient. So how can we run engines and compressors more efficient so that we can save money and that equipment lasts longer. And so and then some of them move over time into leadership roles and operations. And so they're working with the guys that are responsible for maintaining that equipment, work with them so that we stay in compliance and work safely.
Mhm.
And so those are kind of the different paths. We have metallurgy experts, and so people that get involved with welding designs, and if there are failures, what happened with the metallurgy that caused that equipment to fail, and
Mhm.
help people understand how we can make things more reliable.
Mhm. So usually when they're getting started, I mean, you have these people that are fresh out of college, they know the science behind it, but is there kind of a thing for the older people that are already there, kind of shepherding them along, kind of like this apprenticeship? You're still learning the ropes of stuff. When are you really kind of turned out on your own to where you're starting to make decisions on your own, still with some oversight?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And so they would have a mentor, somebody that's kind of helping them and teaching them
Yeah.
and kind of looking over their shoulder. And then, I think, some people progress faster than others, but, I think within a couple of years, they're kind of on their own, but they still have somebody that's looking over their work and make sure that it's that it's fine. And I mean, even today I learn. So it's I've been doing it, like I said, 29 years, and so I'm still learning today as
Mhm.
well. And in fact, I learn from the younger guys now as hopefully as much as they're learning from me. But
Mhm.
so um, so
You see a lot of engineers, and for people I've talked to who they do engineering for a little bit and then they look to get in business in some way or production. Why do you think that is?
well, I think. Probably several reasons. One, it's just kind of the glamorous work. Everybody wants to be
Right.
a part of, doing that $100 million deal,
Right.
and so the business side can be more sexy,
Mhm.
and it is exciting. It's fun to be a part of it. I think the guys that really enjoy the math and science can kind of simplify the business side as well, and make good business decisions because of their understanding of math. And they have a good understanding of how things work, and so they can kind of put all the pieces together to help the customers get the deal that's a win-win for both the customer and for our company as well. Um, and so that, and I think that's some of those guys do a really good job. I've seen engineers become really good businessmen, and so that could be a good fit for some people. And then some really enjoy the technical side and
Mhm.
still just kind of stay with the engineering side.
Uh-huh. Do you think in your company's experience, in your working experience, that companies like having their own engineers transition to the business side because they kind of understand both angles of it? Is there kind of an emphasis on those engineers who are moving over to the operations, or do they want to pick people that are just operations people?
Well, I think people see the value in diversity.
Right.
I think a well-rounded career. I think, particularly for myself, I've done a lot of different things, and it's amazing how things kind of all tie together. And
Yeah.
so, uh, even though like TC Energy doesn't have a lot of, isn't big into LNG, liquid natural gas, but a lot of that experience that I got there, helps me be a better at what I'm doing today. And I think the same thing when those guys that came from engineering over to commercial, it helps them be better commercial guys.
Right.
Now you still need the guys that are very focused on that one area and know it very well. And so, that's why I think, diversity can mean a lot of things, but I think diversity of experience just makes a company better. And so I think you need both of them, people that have been in that same job for a long time, but also people that move around
Right.
and kind of share ideas from other areas and transfer that knowledge.
What is the biggest difference when you move into those new operations and management roles? Is it, you're just talking to a lot more people about how to structure deals? What does it look like on a day-to-day level that's different from the engineers day-to-day?
Well, for me, a lot of it's about leadership. So it's communicating expectations, holding people accountable, and making sure when we say we're going to do something, we get it done. And
Right.
so it's easy to come up with ideas to work more efficiently and work safer, but the hard part's the execution part. And so
Mm-hmm.
a lot of what I do is trying to keep our vision simple so that everybody understands it and it's kind of all marching in the same direction. But yet, if there are barriers, being a part, as a leader, I need to help break down those barriers so they can be successful.
Mm-hmm.
And then, and then communicating the expectations, hold them accountable, and then getting out of the way and
Uh-huh.
let them do their thing. So,
How do you think in the next, say, 10 years, the energy sector is going to change? Because I feel like from what I've read and just things I've heard, it's changed so much in the last 10 to 15 years. Do you think we're going to see this continued change? Do you think there's going to be maybe a plateau at some point? Or do you think that kind of we're in for a new whole world of energy?
well, I think I think for oil specifically in the U.S., I think by the end of this decade, you'll see kind of peak oil usage to where because of efficiencies and other forms of energy, you'll see the use of oil in the U.S. kind of plateau and then start to taper off. I think natural gas will continue to grow. We do have this initiative where we want to be greenhouse gas neutral,
Mm-hmm.
but I think a natural gas is going to be play a huge part of energy for the next 20, 30 years.
Right.
Obviously wind and solar will play a part in it, nuclear will play a part in it,
Mm-hmm.
but natural gas is clean burning. It is, all the other forms of energy. It's very reliable. It's always there. Whereas solar and wind are susceptible to the sun and wind not being there. And so I think you'll see natural gas production continue to increase, for the next 20 or 30 years, and then by 2050, I think you'll see it start to taper off as well. But
Right.
by then we'll
Who
be.
knows what we'll be using? We could
Yeah, that's
be
right.
getting
Right.
energy straight from the sun or something, Star Wars ships and whatnot.
That's right. But
Yeah.
I think as part of that sustainability focus on the environment is, what our industry is trying to do is stop the leaking of natural gas, which is 20 times more potent greenhouse gas effect than
Mhm.
CO2 is. And so finding ways to minimize leaks and then also make sure our equipment runs efficiently so that you're not emitting any more CO2 than what you need to
Mhm.
provide that energy. So
Right.
so I think those are the things, I think there'll certainly be a lot more focus on it, both, from the oil and gas industries. And so that's what I think the next, 15, 20 years will look like.
Uh-huh. And so I don't want to take up too much of your time. So I think I have about two questions left. When they kind of feel like there's a stereotype for all engineers that they're really heavy math and science focused because, when you're going through college, you are taking the hardest calculus classes, the hardest this, and that. How often do you really use that in your day-to-day setting, even maybe past your first initial engineering job? Do you feel like you still kind of have to use some of those principles and stuff you learned? Have you had to kind of keep up with, the math and sciences and whatnot, or is it more of just learning your business and such?
Yeah, so really for engineers, kind of what they're taught in school is really how to solve problems and just
Yeah.
to kind of have a methodology they use to approach things, and then also think about, does the answer make sense? And so, I- you know, when I was in the LNG industry, I probably used more of what I learned in school, both kind of the metallurgy and just, why things work the way they do, the,
Right.
thermodynamics and
Mm.
even some of the vibration stuff from college I learned. I use some of that from time to time, but it's more just kind of the it's more about explaining, having discussions with people on why failures
Mm.
happen and making sure their answers or what they feel like was the cause of the failure makes sense. And so, but it's really what you learn, like I said, to start with, what you learn in college is how to approach a problem and solve it. And then just does the answer make sense? And so those are probably the big things.
Mhm.
In project teams in college that you were on, how to work with other people and
Mhm.
be collaborative, and those skills are always invaluable as well.
Is there a pretty substantial onboarding process whenever you're getting started somewhere? Like, just because I guess each plant probably has its own unique safety stuff you have to learn and whatnot.
Well, yeah. So at the field level, absolutely. I mean, they have to show that they're proficient and qualified to do that work.
Mhm.
That's actually part of the regulations, and so it probably takes a technician out in the field that's new to the industry. It probably takes them a couple of years before they can kind of work on their own,
Right.
even just kind of an entry level position.
Mhm.
Obviously, the higher level positions, the guys that do the electrical and instrumentation work or the mechanics, that takes even longer.
Mhm.
I think the bigger companies do a really good job at onboarding. And it's it's both your day-to-day job, but that there's also the onboarding of all the other stuff, your health
Yeah.
benefits, your investments, and those kinds of things. And then also the regulations, just whether it's insider training and all those kinds of things.
Right.
So there's all that kind of back office training you have to do too. So and then there's a lot of the training you end up doing every year on your computer, and so that's there's
Right.
probably 40 hours of training you do every year just for those
Right.
kinds of things. So
What do you see? I know I said two questions, but this will be the last two, I can
yeah,
promise.
yeah, yeah.
What do you see as the biggest differences then in working at a smaller firm versus a larger firm?
Well, that's a great question, Jay. I think in some ways smaller companies feel more like kind of a family type company.
Right.
There's certainly not as many policies and procedures, which some days are good and some days can be frustrating as well.
Mhm.
One of the challenges you have with small companies is getting everybody to do things consistently and repeatably. Um, and so, but at big companies, you have to be conscious of, what you do for one, you have to do for others. And so
Right.
we kind of forget that we're working with real people who have families. And so I think the challenge is at a big company is to make it feel small and
Uh-huh.
not lose that personal relationship with your people. So, and I think TC Energy does a great job. We had several employees that are impacted by the hurricane over in Louisiana. We had at least one employee whose home was completely destroyed, and so we're going to put him up in a hotel for a couple of weeks until he can kind of get things straightened out. And another couple of guys, their roofs were damaged, and so a couple of other employees went out there with tarps and kind of got things covered up for them and kind of helped get their lives back in
Yeah, that
shape.
makes
So I
sense.
think so. So I think big companies can do it, but I think it is more challenging.
Mhm.
But I will say the other kind of cool thing at small companies, you get involved in a lot of different stuff.
Mhm.
At a big company, you have somebody that's a specialist in everything, and
Mhm.
so at a small company, you got to be kind of a jack of all trades,
Right.
and so there's pluses and minuses. Bigger companies, though, they're going to weather the financial ups and downs of the industry a lot better. They're going to be, they'll just have, more funds and more diverse, and it makes them kind of weather the financial storms better. And so that's so. And then I would say personally for people, as you're coming out of college, it's a lot easier to go from a big company to a small company than a
Right.
small
That's
company
a
to a
good
big
point.
company. I think the big companies do a really good job of training people. So I think if you're coming out of college, I think you ought to gravitate towards the bigger companies because they're going to do a really good job of training you and in the industry you're working in. And then later on, decide whether you want to stay with that big company or go to a smaller one.
Yeah. So my final question is also one that, some people say it's pretty difficult, but looking at your 29 years of experience, if you could kind of give a token line of advice to yourself 29 years ago or to a new starting out engineer student, what would that, Chris Humes line of advice be?
Wow, that's a great question, Jay. Well, I think, you know, every day you got to come into work, willing to work hard, but also have a smile on your face and always find out how you can add value and be an
Right.
asset. I think one of the ways and I learned this lesson kind of late in life, but I think it probably would have served me well early in my career is, um, if you think about two people in the world, one you have the utmost respect for in the world, the other one who you wouldn't give the time of day, and you ask three questions: Can I trust them? Are they committed to excellence? And do they care about me? The person you have all the respect for in the world, you just answered yes to all three of those questions, and the
Right.
person you would give the time of day to, you just figured out why. And so I've always tried to live, work my professional career with those thoughts in mind. But
Yeah.
but the flip side is people either consciously or subconsciously are asking those same questions about us too. And so
Right.
if you always have that mindset, then you're always going to be well received. You're always going to be respected, and people are always going to enjoy working with you. So
Right.
that'd probably be the bit of advice I give myself early on.
Well, I think that's a great line of advice. I think that's a great way for us to wrap up. Thank you again. I really appreciate it. To all our viewers and listeners, stay tuned for more awesome stuff coming up. Once again, thank you, Mr. Humes. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Jay. Appreciate it. A lot of fun.